Hello and welcome back to another evening of shared stories and late night rabbit holes. Tonight we are going deep into something that, on the surface, sounds like a joke. We're going to spend the next few hours examining the philosophy of Peter Griffin. And I know how that sounds. A philosophical analysis of a cartoon character who once spent an entire episode fighting a giant chicken over a bad coupon. A man whose IQ was canonically tested at around 70 in the season, 4-episode petarded, and who was declared by a state agency to be intellectually disabled. A man who has, across 24 seasons and over 450 episodes, demonstrated a near-perfect inability to learn from his mistakes, retain consequences, or behave like a functioning adult for longer than about 11 minutes at a time. But here is the thing. Philosophy has a question it has been wrestling with for over 2,000 years, and Peter Griffin might be the best answer anyone has ever accidentally given. The question comes from John Stuart Mill, the 19th century British philosopher, who wrote one of the most important books in the history of ethics. In his 1863 work, Utilitarianism, Mill made a claim that has been debated in university lecture halls ever since. He wrote that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, and better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. What Mill was arguing is that the quality of your pleasures matters more than the quantity. That a philosopher who suffers is living a better life than a fool who is content. That awareness, intelligence, and the capacity for higher thought are worth the pain they bring, because the alternative, blissful ignorance, is beneath human dignity. Mill was certain about this. The entire Western philosophical tradition has been more or less certain about this for centuries. Knowledge is better than ignorance. Awareness is better than oblivion. The examined life, as Socrates himself declared, is the only life worth living. And then there is Peter Griffin, sitting on his couch in Quahog, Rhode Island, drinking a Pawtucket Patriot Ale, watching television, laughing at something nobody else in the room finds funny, completely, utterly, stubbornly content. Peter Griffin has never read Mill. He has never heard of Socrates. He does not know what the word utilitarianism means, and he would not care if you explained it to him. He is the fool satisfied. He is the pig content. He is everything Mill warned us about, everything the philosophical tradition has spent millennia trying to elevate us above. And he is, by almost every measurable standard of day-to-day living, happier than any philosopher who has ever lived. That is the tension we are going to sit with tonight. Not whether Peter is smart, he is not. Not whether Peter is good. That is genuinely complicated, but whether Peter Griffin, in all his ignorance and impulsiveness and stubborn refusal to examine anything about his own existence, has accidentally stumbled onto something that the greatest minds in human history spent their entire lives trying to articulate. We're going to look at Peter through the lens of Epicurus, the ancient Greek philosopher who argued that happiness comes from simple pleasures. We are going to examine him through Albert Camus, who told us to imagine Sisyphus happy. We are going to hold him up against Plato, against Aristotle, against Nietzsche. Not because Peter has read any of them, because he accidentally embodies what they spent their lives trying to say. There is a book called Family Guy and Philosophy, published by Blackwell in 2007, edited by J. Jeremy Wisniewski from Hartwick College. It is a collection of academic essays from real philosophers at real universities, and it takes the show seriously as a vehicle for examining questions about ethics, identity, religion, death, and what it means to be a person. One of the chapters is called Let Us Now Praise Clueless Men, written by Jerry Summett from Brandeis University, and it is entirely about the philosophical significance of Peter Griffin. We are going to go further than that book went. We are going to spend the next few hours treating a cartoon about a fat man in Rhode Island with the analytical seriousness of a documentary about the meaning of life. And the reason we can do that is because the questions Peter raises, without ever knowing he is raising them, are the same questions that have haunted philosophy since the Greeks sat down in their gardens and started wondering why we are here. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's start at the beginning. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. There is a moment in the history of Western philosophy that changed everything. It happens in Book 7 of Plato's Republic, written around 375 BCE, and it involves a cave. Plato asks us to imagine a group of prisoners who have been chained inside a cave since birth. They cannot move, they cannot turn their heads. All they can see is the wall in front of them. Behind them, there is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people walk back and forth carrying objects. The objects cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners watch these shadows their entire lives. They give the shadows names. They study the shadows. They develop theories about how the shadows behave and why they move the way they do. The shadows are their entire reality. Then one prisoner is freed. He is dragged out of the cave, up into the sunlight, and for the first time, he sees the real world. Real trees, real people, real objects. He realizes that everything he thought was real, the shadows on the wall, was just a projection, a pale imitation of a richer, truer reality that existed above him the entire time. Plato's point is about knowledge and truth. The cave represents ignorance. The sunlight represents philosophical understanding. The freed prisoner represents the philosopher who has seen reality as it truly is and can never go back to believing in shadows. And the other prisoners, the ones still chained in the cave, represent everyone who lives their life without questioning what they see, without examining their assumptions, without seeking the truth. For over 2,000 years, this allegory has been used to argue that knowledge is liberation, that the philosopher's job is to drag people out of their caves and into the light, whether they want to go or not, that living among shadows, content with illusions, is a lesser form of existence than living in the painful brightness of truth. Peter Griffin has never left the cave, not because he tried and failed, not because someone prevented him. Peter Griffin has never left the cave because he has never once looked at the shadows on the wall and wondered if there might be something more. The shadows are his television, his football games, his beer, his friends at the bar, his routine, his comfortable, repetitive, unexamined life. And they are enough for him. They are more than enough. They are everything. This is what makes Peter philosophically fascinating. He is not a prisoner who is fighting against his chains. He is not a prisoner who is suffering in ignorance, desperately wishing for liberation. He is a prisoner who has decorated his section of the cave, invited his friends over, cracked open a cold one, and settled in for the evening. He does not know he is in a cave. He does not care. The question of whether a truer reality exists outside has literally never occurred to him. Now compare Peter to Brian Griffin. Brian is the family dog, voiced by Seth MacFarlane, and he functions as Peter's intellectual opposite within the household. Brian reads books. Brian writes novels, or tries to write novels. Brian drinks martinis, watches art films, subscribes to The New Yorker, and holds opinions about politics, literature, and culture. Brian, in the framework of Plato's cave, is the prisoner who has caught a glimpse of the sunlight. He knows the shadows are shadows. He has read enough and thought enough to understand that there is a deeper reality behind the surface of things. And Brian is miserable. Brian is an alcoholic. He cannot finish his novel because he knows somewhere deep down that he is not as talented as he pretends to be. He dates human women who inevitably leave him. He goes to therapy. He has an inflated sense of his own intelligence that crumbles every time it is seriously tested. In the season's 16 episode, The D in Apartment 23, Brian sends a racially insensitive tweet, is publicly shamed, is kicked out of his own home by the family for their safety, and ends up alone in a run-down apartment. Brian has seen the sunlight, and the sunlight has not made him happy. It has made him pretentious, insecure, and deeply unhappy. This is what Plato did not address in his allegory. He assumed that seeing the truth would be better than living among shadows. He assumed that the freed prisoner, despite the pain of adjustment, would ultimately be grateful for his liberation. He assumed that knowledge is always preferable to ignorance, that truth is always preferable to illusion, that the examined life is always preferable to the unexamined one. But what if it isn't? Think about that for a second. What if the prisoners in the cave are not suffering? What if they are not yearning for liberation? What if they are, in their own limited way, content? What if the freed prisoner, standing in the sunlight, looks back down at the cave and realizes that the people inside are happier than he is? Not because they are wiser, not because their happiness is more sophisticated or more earned, but simply because they do not know what they are missing, and not knowing protects them from a particular kind of suffering that knowledge brings. John Stuart Mill himself, the same philosopher who declared that it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied, acknowledged something that undermines his own argument. In Utilitarianism, he wrote that it is indisputable that the being whose capacities of enjoyment are low has the greatest chance of having them fully satisfied. Mill admitted it. He conceded the point. If your needs are simple and your expectations are low, you are more likely to be content than someone whose needs are complex and whose expectations are high. Peter Griffin has simple needs and low expectations. Brian Griffin has complex needs and high expectations. Peter sleeps soundly, Brian drinks alone. The show has a pattern that reinforces this. Every time Peter accidentally gains intelligence or sophistication, it destroys him. In Petarded, when Peter discovers his IQ is around 70, he is initially devastated, but then he realizes something. Being declared intellectually disabled means he can get away with things. He exploits the diagnosis. He behaves badly and faces no consequences, at least for a while. When a Child Protective Services agent removes his children because he is declared mentally unfit, the show forces Peter back into his regular life by the end of the episode. The status quo restores itself. Peter returns to the cave, and the cave welcomes him back. In other episodes across the series, Peter temporarily gains power, knowledge, or status, and every time it makes things worse. He becomes president of a toy company and nearly brings down Congress in the season 3 episode, Mr. Griffin Goes to Washington. He gets a position of authority and immediately becomes corrupt, not out of malice, but out of incompetence combined with opportunity. The show repeatedly demonstrates that Peter in the cave, Peter in his natural state of cheerful ignorance, is the most stable and least destructive version of Peter that exists. This creates an uncomfortable philosophical proposition. If leaving the cave makes you unhappy and staying in the cave keeps you content, is the cave really a prison? Or is it a shelter? Brian would say it is a prison. Brian believes in the value of knowledge, of culture, of self-improvement. Brian reads and writes and thinks because he believes these things make life richer and more meaningful. But the show consistently undercuts Brian's position by showing that his knowledge has not made him a better person or a happier one. He is pretentious. He is dishonest about his own mediocrity. He uses intellectual superiority as a weapon against people who have done nothing to deserve it. In the Family Guy and Philosophy collection, one of the essays is titled, "Is Brian More of a Person Than Peter?", written by Mark D. White from the College of Staten Island. The question itself is revealing. Brian thinks more, reads more, and reflects more than Peter. But does that make him more of a person? Or has he simply traded one set of shadows for another, more sophisticated set that happens to come with a martini glass? Peter would not understand any of this. If you sat Peter down and explained the allegory of the cave to him, he would probably ask if the cave had a television, and then he would wander off to find a snack. And he would be fine. He would continue to be fine. He has always been fine in his own way, without ever once wondering whether the life he is living is the right one, or the real one, or the one he should be living. And that is the paradox Plato left us with, even if he did not mean to. The prisoners in the cave cannot evaluate their own captivity because they do not know they are captive. They have no frame of reference for a better life because they have never experienced one. Their contentment is real, but it is based on ignorance. Is that contentment worth less because of what it does not know? Is Peter's happiness less valid because he has never questioned it? Or is the very act of questioning what ruins it, the way turning on the lights ruins a dream you are enjoying? The show does not answer this. Family Guy is a comedy, not a philosophy lecture, and it would never frame things this explicitly. But the structure of the show, the way Peter bounces from disaster to disaster without lasting damage, while Brian drinks his way through an existential crisis that never resolves, tells us something. It tells us that the show has taken a position on this question. Even if it would never admit it, the cave is not ideal, but the sunlight is not either. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Now let's talk about pleasure, and about an ancient Greek philosopher who, if he had ever met Peter Griffin, might have recognized something uncomfortably familiar. Epicurus was born in 341 BCE on the island of Samos, and he spent his life developing a philosophy that has been misunderstood for over 2,000 years. When people hear the word Epicurean today, they think of luxury, fine wine, expensive meals, hedonic excess, but that is almost exactly the opposite of what Epicurus actually taught. Epicurus believed that pleasure is the highest good. That is true. He said that the entire point of being alive is to experience pleasure and to avoid pain. But he defined pleasure in a way that would surprise anyone who associates his name with extravagance. For Epicurus, the greatest pleasure is the absence of suffering, not the presence of luxury, the absence of pain. He called this state ataraxia, which translates roughly to tranquility or freedom from disturbance. The second component was aponia, the absence of physical pain. Together, these two states, a mind free from anxiety and a body free from pain, constituted the highest form of human happiness. Epicurus was suspicious of intense pleasures. He thought they led to dependency, anxiety, and disappointment. If you develop a taste for expensive food, you will be miserable every time you cannot afford it. If you chase fame, you will live in constant fear of losing it. If you pursue power, you will always be looking over your shoulder. The smartest path to happiness, Epicurus argued, is to keep your desires simple and your expectations low. Eat plain bread and cheese and you will never be disappointed by a meal. Surround yourself with close friends and you will never be lonely. Avoid politics, fame, and the accumulation of wealth, and you will never be anxious about losing what you have. Epicurus put this into practice. He bought a small property outside the city limits of Athens and called it the Garden. There he and his students lived together in a kind of commune, sharing simple meals, having philosophical conversations, and cultivating friendships. According to the later Stoic philosopher Seneca, there was a sign over the gate that read, "Here, guest, will you be well entertained. Here pleasure is the highest good." But visitors expecting a feast would have been disappointed. What they got was bread, water, cheese, and good conversation. Now think about Peter Griffin's life, not through the lens of comedy, not through the lens of narrative, but through the lens of Epicurus. Peter's pleasures are simple. He drinks beer, but he drinks cheap beer. Pawtucket Patriot ale, brewed locally in Quahog. He does not seek out craft beer or imported wine or anything that requires sophistication to enjoy. He eats food, but he eats whatever is in front of him. He watches television, but he watches whatever is on. His pleasures require almost no effort to obtain and almost no money to sustain. By Epicurus's classification of desires, Peter operates almost entirely within the category of natural and necessary desires. The desires that are easy to satisfy, difficult to eliminate and that bring genuine contentment when met. Food, shelter, companionship, warmth, rest. These are the desires Epicurus said we should focus on, and Peter focuses on them without ever being told to. Then there is the matter of friendship. Epicurus considered friendship the most important element of a happy life. He wrote that of all the means which wisdom acquires to ensure happiness throughout the whole of life, by far the most important is friendship. Not romantic love, not family bonds, friendship. The voluntary association of people who choose to spend time together because they enjoy each other's company. Peter has the drunken clam. Every week, sometimes multiple times a week, Peter sits at the same bar with the same three men. Cleveland Brown, Joe Swanson, and Glenn Quagmire. They drink together. They talk together. They have been doing this for over 20 years of real-world broadcast time and an indeterminate but clearly extensive period of time within the show's continuity. These friendships have survived extraordinary things. Cleveland's wife Loretta had an affair with Quagmire in season 4 that should have destroyed the friend group. It didn't. Cleveland eventually divorced Loretta, but the men continued to drink together at the same bar. Cleveland moved away for his own spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013 before being cancelled. When Cleveland returned to Quahog after the cancellation, he walked back into the drunken clam as though he had never left. Joe is paralysed from the waist down, a paraplegic police officer voiced by Patrick Warburton, and his disability is a source of both jokes and genuine moments of vulnerability across the series. Quagmire is, by any honest assessment, a deeply disturbing person whose behaviour toward women would be criminal in any realistic context. And yet the friendship persists. Epicurus would recognise this. Not the content of these men's conversations, which would horrify him, but the structure. 4 men gathering regularly in a specific place to share a specific experience. The loyalty that survives betrayal and distance and personal catastrophe. The simplicity of just showing up and being present with people who know you. This is the garden relocated to a bar in Rhode Island. The beer is cheaper than the wine, the conversation is considerably less philosophical, but the function is identical. These men provide each other with the thing Epicurus said matters most: reliable, consistent, chosen companionship. And let's be specific about what this companionship looks like, because the specificity matters. Cleveland Brown left Quahog entirely. He moved to Steuben, Virginia, to start a new life with his new wife, Donna. That was the premise of The Cleveland Show, his spin-off, which ran for 4 seasons from 2009 to 2013 on Fox. Cleveland built a different life in a different city with a different social circle. He had every reason to never come back. His ex-wife was in Quahog. His old friends were in Quahog. The memories of his failed marriage were in Quahog. Everything that Cleveland left behind was something he had good reason to leave behind. And when The Cleveland Show was cancelled, when the spin-off ended and the character needed somewhere to go, Cleveland came home. He walked back into the drunken clam. He sat down at the bar, he picked up a beer, and the show continued as though the years away had been a weekend trip. Nobody made a speech, nobody had a tearful reunion. The men just absorbed Cleveland back into the group, the way a river absorbs a tributary, naturally and without comment, because that is what the group does. It absorbs, it persists, it continues. Joe Swanson's paralysis adds another dimension. Joe was shot in the line of duty and has used a wheelchair for the majority of the series. His disability is not invisible. It is not something the other men can ignore or forget. Every time they go somewhere together, Joe's wheelchair is there. Every time they plan an activity, Joe's limitations are a factor. The show sometimes handles this with sensitivity and sometimes handles it with cruelty, but the consistent underlying fact is that Peter, Cleveland, and Quagmire have never abandoned Joe because of his disability. They have never suggested he find other friends. They have never treated his wheelchair as a reason to exclude him. They complain about it sometimes. They make jokes about it frequently, but they keep including him. They keep showing up, and Joe keeps showing up for them. This is what friendship looks like when you strip away the intellectual justifications and the philosophical frameworks and their arguments about what makes a relationship meaningful. It looks like four men at a bar who will not stop coming. It looks like loyalty that cannot explain itself. It looks like commitment that is not based on shared values or mutual benefit or conscious choice, but on something older and deeper and less articulate than any of those things. It looks like a habit of the body, a reflex of the heart, the great reason, doing what it does without permission, from the small reason that thinks it is in charge. Here is where it gets interesting. Epicurus said that you need wisdom alongside pleasure, that you need to understand why simple pleasures are better than complex ones. That philosophical reasoning is what separates genuine Epicurean contentment from mere animal satisfaction. Peter has none of this. Peter does not understand why his life works. He does not know that his simple desires are the right desires. He has not reasoned his way to contentment. He has stumbled into it, the way a blind person might stumble into a garden and sit down in the exact right spot without ever seeing the flowers. Does that matter? Does it matter whether your happiness is the product of philosophical reasoning or the product of dumb luck? Epicurus would say yes. The philosopher's happiness is more stable, more resilient, more defensible against the inevitable disruptions of life. If you understand why you are happy, you can protect that happiness by continuing to make the right choices. If you do not understand why you are happy, you are vulnerable to losing it the moment circumstances change. But Peter's circumstances change constantly. Every episode brings a new catastrophe, a new disruption, a new threat to everything he has. And every episode, his happiness reasserts itself. Not because he has thought his way through the crisis and returned to equilibrium through philosophical reasoning, but because his mind does not hold on to disruption. He does not retain trauma the way a more intelligent person would. The crisis comes, the crisis passes, and Peter is back on his couch with a beer, genuinely content, as though nothing happened. Epicurus might look at this and see an animal, not a philosopher, a being who experiences pleasure, but does not understand it, a pig satisfied, in Mill's terms, rather than a Socrates dissatisfied. But he might also look at it and see something else, something that his own students, for all their philosophical sophistication, might never have achieved as consistently or as effortlessly as Peter Griffin achieves it every single day of his fictional life. He might see a man who is genuinely happy. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Now let's talk about the boulder. In 1942, the French philosopher Albert Camus published an essay called The Myth of Sisyphus. It is one of the most important works of philosophy written in the 20th century, and it begins with a sentence that still startles people who encounter it for the first time. Camus wrote that there is but one truly serious philosophical question, and that is suicide. He was not being dramatic. He was not being provocative for its own sake. He meant it literally. Camus believed that the fundamental question of philosophy is not what is true or what is good, or how should we live. It is whether we should bother living at all. The essay builds toward a retelling of the Greek myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was a king who defied the gods. He put death itself in chains so that no human would have to die. When the gods finally caught him, they devised a punishment they considered worse than death. Sisyphus would push a boulder up a mountain. Every time he neared the top, the boulder would roll back down, and Sisyphus would walk back down after it and start pushing again. Forever. An eternity of pointless, exhausting, repetitive labour, with no result, no progress, and no hope of completion. Camus was fascinated by the moment when Sisyphus walks back down the mountain, the moment when the boulder has already rolled back to the bottom and Sisyphus has not yet started pushing. In that pause, that brief interval between one round of futile labour and the next, Sisyphus becomes conscious of his situation. He knows the boulder will roll back down. He knows nothing will change. He knows his punishment is eternal and his labour is meaningless. And in that moment of full awareness, Camus says something extraordinary. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Camus is not saying that Sisyphus's situation is good. He is saying that Sisyphus, in the face of total meaninglessness, can choose to embrace his condition rather than be destroyed by it. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. Happiness for Camus does not come from achieving goals or arriving at destinations. It comes from the act of striving, from the refusal to surrender to despair, even when despair is the only rational response. Now look at Peter Griffin's life. Every episode, Peter encounters a problem. Sometimes he creates the problem himself. Sometimes it lands on him from outside. He gets fired. He starts a fight. He accidentally destroys property, ruins relationships, causes physical harm to himself and others. He struggles with the problem for approximately 22 minutes of broadcast time. Sometimes he solves it. Sometimes it solves itself. Sometimes it simply stops mattering because the episode ends. And then the next week, Peter is back at the beginning. The slate is clean. The boulder is at the bottom of the mountain. Nothing he learned has carried over. Nothing he suffered has left a mark. This is not an exaggeration. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999 on Fox. As of 2026, the show has aired over 450 episodes across 24 seasons. In that time, Peter has been injured, humiliated, arrested, hospitalized, and killed more times than anyone could reasonably count. He has lost jobs, wrecked his house, damaged his marriage, endangered his children, and alienated everyone around him. And at the beginning of the next episode, he is sitting on his couch, watching television, with a beer in his hand, exactly where he started. Camus compared Sisyphus to the modern worker. He wrote that the workman of today works every day in his life at the same tasks, and this fate is no less absurd. But it is tragic only at the rare moments when it becomes conscious. This is the key. Camus believed that the absurdity of existence is only tragic when you're aware of it. When you're conscious of the repetition, the futility, the meaninglessness of the cycle. Peter is never conscious of it. Peter pushes his boulder up the mountain every single episode and never once looks down and wonders why. He does not experience the tragic pause that Camus described, the walk back down the mountain where Sisyphus contemplates the eternity of his punishment. Peter does not contemplate. Peter does not look back. Peter reaches the bottom of the mountain and immediately starts pushing again, not with grim determination or defiant joy, but with the same cheerful enthusiasm he had the first time. Camus said we must imagine Sisyphus happy. We do not have to imagine Peter happy. We can see it. We can watch it. He is right there, pushing his boulder, whistling while he does it, completely unaware that the boulder will roll back down, completely undisturbed when it does. This raises a question that Camus himself might have found uncomfortable. Camus argued that consciousness of the absurd is necessary for authentic happiness, that you have to see the meaninglessness clearly without flinching and then choose to persist anyway. That is what makes Sisyphus a hero, not the pushing of the boulder, but the awareness that the pushing is pointless, combined with the refusal to stop. But Peter's happiness is not built on awareness. It is built on the total absence of awareness. He does not confront the absurd. He does not even see it. His happiness is not defiant, it is oblivious, and yet it is real. He experiences genuine contentment, genuine pleasure, genuine satisfaction in his daily life. His happiness is not philosophical. It is not earned through struggle or achieved through conscious revolt against meaninglessness. It is just there, the way sunlight is there, the way gravity is there, requiring no effort and no understanding to experience. Is oblivious happiness less real than defiant happiness? Is Peter's contentment less valid than Sisyphus's because Peter never had to fight for it? Camus would probably say yes. The whole point of the myth of Sisyphus is that meaning comes from the conscious refusal to surrender. Without consciousness, there is no refusal, and without refusal, there is no triumph. But the show suggests something else. The show suggests that the boulder does not care whether you are conscious of it or not. The mountain does not care whether you understand the absurdity. The repetition continues regardless of your awareness. And if the repetition continues regardless, and if the boulder rolls back down regardless, and if nothing changes regardless of whether you confront the meaninglessness or ignore it entirely, then maybe the only real difference between Sisyphus and Peter Griffin is that one of them suffers while pushing and the other one does not. The structure of the show itself functions as an argument for Peter's version of existence. Family Guy does not maintain continuity the way other shows do. Characters die and come back. Injuries heal instantly. Consequences evaporate between episodes. The show resets. Not every show does this. The Simpsons, Family Guy's closest comparison, also resets, but The Simpsons has never made the reset itself feel meaningful. Family Guy's reset is aggressive, almost defiant. The show knows it resets. The characters occasionally acknowledge that they reset, and the show keeps going anyway, pushing the boulder up, watching it roll down, and starting a new episode the following Sunday night, as though none of it ever happened. That is the Sisyphean structure, made literal. Not as metaphor, but as format. Peter Griffin lives inside an eternal recurrence that he cannot perceive and does not need to perceive. He is the only version of Sisyphus who does not need to be imagined happy because the imagining was never necessary. He was always happy. He was happy before the boulder, and he will be happy after it. The mountain is just the place where he happens to be standing. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Now we need to talk about something more difficult. We need to talk about whether Peter Griffin is responsible for the things he does. This is not a simple question. It might be the most complicated philosophical question the show raises, even though the show itself treats it as a punchline. Peter does terrible things. He injures people. He destroys property. He endangers his children. He causes suffering on a scale that, if you took the comedy away and just looked at the raw facts, would make him a genuinely dangerous person. And the question is whether he can be held morally accountable for any of it. In the Season 4 episode Petarded, Peter takes an IQ test after winning a game of Trivial Pursuit and becoming convinced he is a genius. Brian, tired of Peter's insufferable bragging, challenges him to apply for the MacArthur Genius Grant. The test results come back and reveal that Peter's IQ is approximately 70, which places him just below the threshold for intellectual disability. A state agent confirms the diagnosis. Peter Griffin is, according to the standardized instruments of cognitive assessment, intellectually disabled. Peter's initial reaction is depression. He is upset. He does not want to be labeled this way. But then something shifts. He accidentally runs over Tom Tucker, the local news anchor, with his car. Tucker starts to get angry, but when he realizes it is Peter, the man who has just been declared intellectually disabled, he lets it go. He does not call the police. He does not press charges. He just walks away. And Peter realizes something. Being classified as disabled means people will not hold him accountable. He can do whatever he wants and people will excuse it. Peter immediately begins exploiting this. He kicks open doors in the women's restroom. He behaves inappropriately in public. He does things that would get any other person arrested or ostracized, and he does them with a smile, announcing his disability as a shield against consequences. This is funny on the surface, but underneath the comedy, there is a genuine philosophical problem. The question of moral responsibility has occupied philosophers for centuries. Immanuel Kant the 18th century German philosopher, argued that moral responsibility requires rational agency. You can only be held accountable for your actions if you have the capacity to understand what you're doing, to evaluate the consequences, and to choose differently. Children are not held to the same moral standard as adults because their rational capacities are not fully developed. People with severe cognitive impairments may be excused from certain moral judgments because they cannot fully comprehend the nature and consequences of their actions. Peter occupies an uncomfortable middle ground. His IQ is low, but he is clearly capable of strategic thinking. The very fact that he exploits his diagnosis proves a kind of intelligence. He understands that the label gives him power. He understands that other people will treat him differently because of it. He understands cause and effect well enough to manipulate social situations to his advantage. This is not the behaviour of someone who genuinely cannot understand consequences. This is the behaviour of someone who understands consequences perfectly well and has found a way to avoid them. Aristotle approached moral responsibility differently than Kant. In the Nicomachean Ethics, written around 340 BCE, Aristotle argued that virtue is not a single decision, but a habit. You become courageous by practicing courage. You become generous by practicing generosity. You become just by habitually making just decisions. Virtue, for Aristotle, is a stable disposition of character that develops through repetition. Peter has habits, but they are not virtuous habits. He habitually acts on impulse. He habitually prioritizes his own immediate desires over the welfare of others. He habitually avoids responsibility and seeks the path of least resistance. By Aristotle's framework, Peter has developed a stable disposition, but it is a disposition toward vice rather than virtue. He is reliably selfish, reliably impulsive, and reliably destructive. These are not accidents, they are patterns. But Aristotle also said something else. He said that happiness, which he called eudaimonia, is the highest good, the ultimate goal of all human activity. Everything we do because we believe it will make us happy. And here is where Peter complicates things. If Peter is happy, and if happiness is the highest good, then has Peter achieved eudaimonia? Not through the cultivation of virtue, as Aristotle prescribed, but through a back door that Aristotle never anticipated. A back door made of ignorance, impulse, and the structural forgiveness of an animated universe that resets every week. The show itself seems to acknowledge this paradox. In Petarded, after Peter's children are taken away by Child Protective Services because he's deemed unfit, the episode does not end with Peter learning a lesson about responsibility. It ends with Peter getting his children back through a series of events that have nothing to do with personal growth or moral development. The system that took his children returns them, not because Peter has changed, but because the episode needs to end and the status quo needs to restore. Consequences in Peter's world are real but temporary. The pain is genuine, but it does not persist. The damage is significant, but it gets repaired between episodes. This is a universe that has been structurally designed to forgive Peter for everything he does. And because the universe forgives him, the question of whether he should be forgiven becomes moot. You cannot hold someone accountable in a world where accountability has no teeth. Think about what that means for moral philosophy. Every major ethical system, from Kant to Aristotle to the utilitarians, assumes that consequences matter, that your actions produce results that affect other people, and that those results are the basis for moral evaluation. But in Peter's universe, consequences dissolve, pain heals, death reverses, relationships repair. The moral calculus that underlies every ethical system in the history of philosophy simply does not apply to Peter Griffin, because the world he inhabits will not let consequences stick. That does not make Peter good. It makes him something philosophy has no clean category for: a moral agent in a universe without moral consequences, a person who acts but whose actions do not ultimately produce lasting effects. He is playing a game where the score resets to 0 every Sunday night, and he does not even know he is playing. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. There is a famous line from Friedrich Nietzsche. "God is dead," he wrote, "and we have killed him." It appears in his 1882 book, The Gay Science, and it is one of the most misunderstood sentences in the history of philosophy. Nietzsche was not celebrating. He was not being edgy or provocative. He was describing what he saw as a crisis in Western civilization. The religious and metaphysical frameworks that had given European culture its sense of meaning and purpose for centuries were collapsing. Science was replacing faith. Reason was replacing revelation. And Nietzsche recognized that when you remove God from the center of a culture's moral and existential framework, everything built on that foundation collapses with it. Morality, purpose, meaning, all of it. Peter Griffin is a lapsed Catholic. His stepfather, Francis Griffin, was a devout Catholic who imposed strict religious values on the household. Francis dies in season 5 in the episode Peter's Two Dads, crushed by a unicycle that Peter was riding. Even the manner of Francis's death is absurd. A man killed by his own son's incompetence on a novelty vehicle. Francis represented the old order, the religious authority that once governed Peter's world, and Peter killed him. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but through the kind of careless, oblivious destruction that defines everything Peter does. After Francis dies, Peter discovers that Francis was not actually his biological father. This revelation, combined with Francis's death, should create an existential crisis. The authority figure who defined Peter's moral framework is gone, and the moral framework itself is revealed to have been built on a lie. Peter was never Francis's son. The rules Francis imposed were imposed on a child who did not belong to him. But Peter does not have an existential crisis. He never has existential crises because he lacks the self-awareness to experience them. The information lands, he processes it at whatever level he is capable of processing it, and he moves on. The old moral order collapses, and Peter does not notice because he was never really following it in the first place. He attended church because his family attended church. He observed Catholic rituals because they were the rituals of his household. None of it ever penetrated to the level of genuine belief or conviction. In the season 4 episode The Father, the Son and the Holy Fonds, Peter takes this to its logical extreme. He creates his own religion, not out of spiritual seeking or philosophical inquiry, but because he likes the television character Arthur Fonzarelli from Happy Days. He founds the Church of the Holy Fonds, a religion based entirely on the values and aesthetic of a fictional character from a 1970s sitcom. The congregation gathers, they worship, they observe rituals. The religion functions, at least for a while, as a genuine social institution within Quahog. This is Nietzsche's prediction made flesh. When God dies, Nietzsche warned, humans will create new idols, not because the new idols are worthy of worship, but because humans need something to worship. The need is structural. It is built into the species. Remove the old God, and people will elevate whatever is closest at hand. For Peter, the closest thing at hand is a fictional greaser from a television show that went off the air decades ago. The Family Guy and Philosophy collection includes a chapter on this exact phenomenon. David Kyle Johnson, a philosopher at King's College, wrote an essay titled Francis Griffin and the Church of the Holy Fonds, examining what the episode reveals about religious exclusivism and the nature of genuine religious belief. Johnson argues that the episode forces us to ask what separates a real religion from a fake one. If Peter's followers genuinely believe in the Fonds, and if their belief provides them with community and purpose and comfort, is their religion less valid than a religion based on a text written thousands of years ago by people they have never met? This is not a question the show answers directly. Family Guy is not a theological treatise, But the show does something that is philosophically significant. It presents Peter's religion with the same level of seriousness and the same level of absurdity as it presents every other religion in the show. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, all of them are treated with the same irreverent humour. The show does not distinguish between worshipping the Fonz and worshipping God because, from the show's perspective, the distinction is less clear than we might want it to be. Belief is belief. Community is community. The object of worship matters less than the function worship serves. Peter's relationship with death is also relevant here. Death is a recurring character in the show, personified as a figure in a hooded robe who first appeared in the pilot episode, Death Has a Shadow. Death was originally voiced by Norm MacDonald and later by Adam Carolla. Peter has had multiple conversations with death. He has negotiated with death. He has hung out with death at his home. He treats death the way he treats everyone else in his life, with a combination of casual familiarity and mild disregard. Epicurus wrote that death is nothing to us, for when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we do not exist. Therefore, death is nothing to either the living or the dead. This was Epicurus's answer to the fear of death, which he considered one of the two great obstacles to human happiness, the other being fear of the gods. Peter Griffin fears neither. He does not fear the gods because he does not take them seriously enough to fear them, and he does not fear death because, in his universe, death is a person you can talk to, bargain with, and eventually get past. Peter has died and come back. He has faced death and walked away. In his world, death is not final. It is an inconvenience like a traffic jam or a broken television. This casual relationship with mortality would have delighted Epicurus, not because Epicurus wanted people to take death lightly, but because he wanted people to stop being paralyzed by the fear of it. The fear of death, Epicurus argued, prevents people from living fully in the present. If you are constantly worried about dying, you cannot enjoy being alive. Peter enjoys being alive, not in a philosophical way, not because he has conquered his fear of death through rational argument. He enjoys it the way a dog enjoys a sunny afternoon, fully, unreflectively, and without any sense that it should be more complicated than it is. Nietzsche said that God is dead and we killed him. Peter killed his father, the representative of God in his life. And then he made a new God out of a television character. And then he went home and watched television. The old moral order collapsed. Peter did not notice. The universe went silent. Peter turned up the volume. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Now we need to go somewhere darker. We need to talk about a theory that changes everything about Peter Griffin if you let it. There is a reading of Family Guy that has circulated among fans for years, and once you hear it, you cannot watch the show the same way again. The theory is straightforward in its premise and devastating in its implications. Everything we have ever seen on Family Guy is happening inside the mind of Peter Griffin. Not the Peter Griffin on the show, not the cheerful, oblivious, bumbling father we have been analysing for the past hour. The real Peter Griffin, the one lying in a bed in a psychiatric facility somewhere in Rhode Island, lost inside a fantasy he constructed to survive the worst thing a human being can experience. According to this theory, Peter's real life looks nothing like the show. In reality, his children are different. Meg in the real world is beautiful. She is the most popular girl at her high school. She is confident and social, and everything the Meg on the show is not. Chris in reality has an intellectual disability. He did not get enough oxygen when he was born, and it affected his cognitive development. One night, Meg takes Chris to a party. She drinks too much. Chris has a panic attack. The party is overwhelming for him, and he needs to leave. Meg, who has been drinking, makes the decision to drive them home. She should not be behind the wheel. She knows it. But Chris needs her and there is nobody else. There is an accident. Both Meg and Chris are killed. Lois, Peter's wife, cannot survive the loss of two children. The grief is total and absolute, and it breaks something inside her that cannot be repaired. While pregnant with what would have been their third child, Lois takes her own life. Peter loses everything: his daughter, his son, his wife, his unborn child. Every person in the world who loved him and depended on him and made his life worth living, gone in the space of days. The grief does not just break Peter, it annihilates him. His mind, unable to process a loss this complete, does the only thing it can do to protect itself. It builds a new world, a world where his children are alive, where his wife is alive, where nobody can die permanently, where reality is flexible enough that no tragedy is ever final. That world is Family Guy. Under this theory, every element of the show takes on a different meaning. Meg is ugly and unpopular in Peter's fantasy because Peter's mind cannot bear to recreate her as she actually was. If fantasy Meg were beautiful and popular, she would be too close to the real Meg, and the resemblance would threaten the illusion. So Peter's subconscious disfigures her, makes her the family's punching bag, makes her invisible and unlovable, because the real Meg was too lovable, and remembering that love would destroy the fantasy. Chris is not intellectually disabled in the fantasy the way he was in reality. Instead, Chris is slow and awkward, but functional. Peter's mind has softened the reality of Chris's condition, making him a gentle, bumbling teenager rather than a child who needed constant care and supervision. The fantasy preserves Chris but changes him just enough that looking at him does not trigger the memory of the real Chris sitting in the back seat of Meg's car on the night of the accident. Stewie, the baby who was never born, exists in the fantasy as a genius, a supervillain, a child with the intelligence of an adult and the vocabulary of a professor. Peter's mind gave his unborn child everything, made him the smartest person in the room, made him capable and independent and brilliant. Because in reality, this child never got the chance to be anything at all. And the cutaway gags. This is perhaps the theory's most elegant insight. The cutaways are dissociative episodes. They are Peter's mind jumping away from the present moment because the present moment is threatening to become too real, too painful, too close to the truth. Every time a conversation in the fantasy approaches something that might force Peter to confront his loss, his brain fires a cutaway. It throws up a random, distracting, unrelated image or scenario, and by the time the cutaway ends, the dangerous moment has passed. The conversation has moved on. The threat has been neutralized. This is exactly how dissociation works in trauma patients. The mind, when confronted with stimuli that echo the original traumatic event, detaches. It goes somewhere else. It produces intrusive thoughts, random memories, bizarre associations, anything to pull the conscious mind away from the trigger. Family Guy's cutaway gags are not a comedy device under this reading. They are a clinical symptom. Think about what this means for everything we have discussed. If this theory is true, then Peter's ignorance is not a product of low intelligence. It is a product of the most sophisticated defense mechanism the human mind is capable of producing. His inability to learn, to grow, to retain consequences. These are not cognitive limitations. They are psychological necessities. The fantasy must reset, because if consequences accumulated, if grief built up, if loss became permanent within the fantasy, the walls would crack and Peter would have to face what actually happened. Nietzsche wrote that we have art so that we shall not die of the truth. He meant it as a statement about the function of creative expression, about why humans make music and paint pictures and tell stories. We create because reality, in its raw form, is sometimes more than consciousness can bear. Art provides a buffer between us and the truths that would destroy us if we faced them directly. Under this theory, Peter Griffin has created the most ambitious work of art in the history of human suffering. An entire animated universe, complete with characters, storylines, recurring jokes, and 24 seasons of content. all generated by a mind that would rather build a world than live in the one where his children are dead. Remember the allegory of the cave from earlier. Plato imagined prisoners who were chained in a cave, watching shadows, believing the shadows were reality. We discussed Peter as a prisoner who never left the cave and was content among the shadows. But under this theory, Peter is not a prisoner who never left. He is a man who saw reality, who stood in the sunlight, who experienced the full brightness and horror of the real world, and who then built his own cave to crawl back into. He chained himself to the wall. He designed the shadows. He constructed every detail of his prison with the desperate precision of a man who knows that the alternative to illusion is annihilation. That is not ignorance. That is the deepest kind of wisdom the human mind is capable of, the wisdom of survival. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Now let's talk about the people Peter loves. Because whether the fantasy theory is true or not, Peter's relationships are where his philosophy becomes personal, and where the philosophical questions stop being abstract and start to ache. Aristotle wrote extensively about friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics, composed around 340 BCE. He identified 3 types of friendship. The first is friendship of utility, where people associate because they are useful to each other. Business partners, colleagues, people who help each other get things done. The second is friendship of pleasure, where people associate because they enjoy each other's company, drinking buddies. People who share hobbies and interests. The third and highest is friendship of virtue. This is the friendship between people who recognize and admire goodness in each other, who want the best for each other, not because it benefits them, but because they genuinely care about the other person's well-being. Aristotle considered this the rarest and most valuable form of human connection. Peter's friendships do not fit neatly into any of these categories. On the surface, his relationship with Cleveland, Joe, and Quagmire looks like a friendship of pleasure. They drink together at the Drunken Clam. They share experiences. They enjoy each other's company. But the friendship has endured things that a mere pleasure friendship would not survive. Cleveland's wife cheated on him with Quagmire. That happened. In season 4, Loretta Brown had an affair with Glenn Quagmire, and the fallout nearly destroyed both the marriage and the friendship. Cleveland and Quagmire eventually reconciled, not through a deep conversation about forgiveness or boundaries, but through a boxing match where they hit each other until the anger dissipated. Then they went back to the bar. Joe Swanson's paralysis is a constant presence in the group. He is a paraplegic police officer who uses a wheelchair, and the show oscillates between treating his disability as a source of humour and treating it as a source of genuine pathos. Joe sometimes resents his condition. Joe sometimes overcompensates. Joe sometimes breaks down. And through all of it, Peter, Cleveland, and Quagmire keep showing up. They do not always handle it well. They sometimes make jokes at Joe's expense that are cruel, even by the show's standards. But they keep showing up. That persistence matters. Quagmire is perhaps the most challenging element of the friend group from a philosophical perspective. Glenn Quagmire's behaviour toward women is, in any realistic context, predatory and criminal. The show has softened this somewhat in later seasons, but the character's core identity for much of the series has been as a compulsive sexual predator whose catchphrase is a lascivious giggity. The men are friends with Quagmire despite this. They do not condone his behaviour, exactly, but they do not ostracise him for it either. This raises uncomfortable questions about complicity and the limits of friendship. But strip away the specifics and look at the structure. 4 men, meeting regularly for decades, supporting each other through personal catastrophes, maintaining a bond that persists despite betrayals and differences and moral failures. That structure is closer to Aristotle's friendship of virtue than it has any right to be, not because these men are virtuous, they are not, but because the commitment itself, the habit of showing up, the loyalty that survives everything the show throws at it, has a quality that transcends utility and pleasure. They choose each other. Again and again, despite everything, they choose each other. Now let's talk about Lois. Lois Griffin, born Lois Pewterschmidt, is the daughter of Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt, one of the wealthiest families in Rhode Island. She attended an elite preparatory school. She grew up in a mansion. She had access to every advantage that money and social status can provide. And she married Peter. This is one of the great unexplained mysteries of the show, and it is also one of its most philosophically interesting elements. Lois married down. She married spectacularly, almost absurdly down. Peter has no money, no status, no ambition, no sophistication, and no particular talent for anything except surviving his own stupidity. By every conventional measure of what makes a good partner, Peter fails. And yet Lois chose him, stays with him, and despite frequent conflict and periodic separations, consistently returns to him. One reading of this is that Lois is broken in some way, that her relationship with her controlling father drove her to seek out a partner who was the opposite of everything Carter Pewterschmidt represented. There is evidence for this in the show. Another reading is that the show simply does not take its own continuity seriously enough for this question to matter. But there is a third reading that is more interesting. Peter is incapable of pretending. He lacks the cognitive sophistication to perform a version of himself that is different from what he actually is. When Peter speaks, he says what he thinks. When Peter acts, he acts on what he feels. There is no filter, no calculation, no strategic self-presentation. In a world of social performance, Peter is the only person in Lois's life who has never worn a mask. Her father performs wealth and authority. Her mother performs propriety. Her social circle performs sophistication. Peter performs nothing. He is exactly what he appears to be. And for someone who grew up surrounded by performance, that kind of radical authenticity might be the most attractive quality a person can have. Whether or not this reading is correct, the relationship works. It works badly, messily, destructively, but it works. Peter and Lois have been married for the entire run of the show. They have raised 3 children. They have survived infidelity, separation, Peter's mother's death, and countless crises that would end most marriages. And they are still together. Not happily ever after, but together. Then there is Meg. The show's treatment of Meg Griffin is, by any honest assessment, difficult to watch. Peter treats Meg with a level of cruelty that goes beyond comedy into something that feels genuinely uncomfortable. He ignores her, he mocks her, he physically harms her in ways that are played for laughs, but that carry a weight that the show's comedic structure cannot fully absorb. Under one reading, Meg is the family's scapegoat. She absorbs the dysfunction so the rest of the family does not have to. She is the pressure valve, the target, the person designated to receive the damage that would otherwise tear the family apart. And she stays, she endures, she does not leave. In that endurance there is something that might be mistaken for weakness, but might actually be the opposite. Meg is the foundation. She holds the weight so that everyone else can stand. And the family's greatest fear, if they were ever honest enough to articulate it, said it, is not that Meg might break. It is that Meg might decide she is done holding. That is Meg Griffin. She is not a punching bag, she is a foundation. And if the foundation walks away, the house comes down. And then there is the relationship that sits at the philosophical heart of the show. Peter and Brian, the man and his dog, except that the dog reads Dostoevsky and the man can barely read a menu. The Family Guy and Philosophy collection includes a chapter titled Is Brian More of a Person Than Peter?, written by Mark D. White from the College of Staten Island. The question is not idle. Brian speaks fluent English. He drives a car. He votes in elections. He dates human women. He writes novels badly. He holds opinions about politics, literature, art and culture. He has a therapist. He has a social security number. By every behavioural and cognitive metric that we use to define personhood, Brian is more of a person than the majority of actual humans on the show, and certainly more of a person than Peter. Peter is Brian's owner. Brian is Peter's pet. The power dynamic is inverted from what intelligence would predict. The smarter being is subordinate to the less intelligent one, not through force or coercion, but through the structure of their relationship. Brian chose to live in Peter's house. Brian chose to remain part of Peter's family. Brian, who could presumably live independently and probably find more intellectually stimulating company, chooses to sleep on the couch in the living room of a man who once accidentally set that couch on fire. This inversion matters philosophically because it challenges the assumption that intelligence should determine social hierarchy. The Enlightenment, the philosophical movement that shaped the modern Western world, was built on the premise that reason is the highest human faculty and that the most rational members of society should lead. Peter Griffin's household inverts this premise. The least rational member is the patriarch. The most rational member is the pet. And the household functions. Not well, not smoothly, not without constant catastrophe, but it functions, it persists, it continues. Brian stays because Peter offers him something that intelligence cannot provide: belonging. Brian has tried to live outside the Griffin household. In the season's 16 episode, The D in Apartment 23, Brian is kicked out of the house after a social media scandal and ends up alone in a shabby apartment. He is miserable. Not because the apartment is bad, although it is, but because he is alone. His intelligence cannot keep him company. His literary pretensions cannot fill the silence. His philosophical sophistication cannot replace the experience of lying on the couch while the family watches television around him. Brian comes back. He always comes back. Because the thing Peter provides, the thing the Griffin household provides, is not available anywhere else at any price. It is the unconditional, irrational, philosophically indefensible warmth of a family that will always let you in, no matter what you have done, no matter how badly you have failed, no matter how many times you have disappointed them. Peter cannot explain why Brian is welcome. Peter cannot explain anything. But Brian is welcome. The door is open, the couch is there. And Brian, for all his intelligence, has never found anything better than that couch in that living room, in that house, on Spooner Street. This is what philosophy misses when it evaluates life through the lens of the mind alone. The mind can analyze belonging, but it cannot produce it. The mind can deconstruct a family, but it cannot build one. The mind can identify the flaws in every relationship Peter has, and it will be correct about every single one. And Peter will still have those relationships, and the mind will still be alone with its correctness. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Now let's talk about the body, because philosophy has spent most of its history privileging the mind over the body, treating physical existence as something to be transcended or controlled or subordinated to reason. And Peter Griffin represents the most thorough rejection of that hierarchy in the history of animated television. Nietzsche wrote about this in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, published between 1883 and 1885. In a section called Of the Despisers of the Body, Nietzsche made an argument that was radical for its time and remains radical now. He argued that the body is the great reason, and that what we call the mind, the conscious intellect, is merely the small reason, a tool that the body uses rather than the other way around. Nietzsche was pushing back against centuries of philosophy that treated the body as a distraction from truth, a prison for the soul, a source of error and temptation that had to be overcome through rational discipline. Peter Griffin lives entirely through his body. This is not a subtle observation. It is the most obvious thing about him. Peter eats, Peter drinks, Peter fights, Peter sleeps, Peter injures himself and recovers. Peter's entire existence is organized around physical experience. His decisions come from appetite, not analysis. His responses come from instinct, not reflection. He does not think about what to do. He feels what to do in his body, and then he does it. By Nietzsche's framework, this makes Peter more connected to the great reason than nearly any other character in the show. Brian thinks, Brian analyzes, Brian reads and reflects and reasons. Brian operates from the small reason, the conscious intellect that Nietzsche considered secondary to the body's deeper wisdom. And Brian is miserable. Peter operates from the body, from instinct and appetite and physical response. And Peter is, in his own way, functional. Consider the chicken fights. These are recurring sequences in Family Guy, where Peter encounters a giant chicken named Ernie, and the two of them engage in prolonged, elaborate, physically devastating battles. The fights span multiple city blocks. They destroy buildings, vehicles, and infrastructure. They go on for minutes at a time, with the animation fully committing to the scale and intensity of the destruction. And they accomplish nothing. The chicken fights have no meaningful cause. In the first instance, Ernie gave Peter a coupon that turned out to be expired. That is the provocation, an expired coupon. From that trivial offence, a rivalry has persisted for the entire run of the show, producing combat sequences that rival action films in their choreography and scope. There is no resolution. The fights end inconclusively. Both Peter and Ernie survive, and they do it again in a later episode, and again, and again. Philosophically, the chicken fights are pure physicality. They are the body asserting itself over narrative logic. There is no reason for these fights to happen, and no consequence when they end. They exist because the body wants to fight, because physical conflict is, for Peter, an end in itself rather than a means to anything. The chicken fights are not about the coupon, or about pride, or about territory. They are about the physical experience of fighting, the impact, the movement, the exertion. Peter is fully alive during these sequences in a way that he is not fully alive during conversations or domestic scenes. His body is doing what it wants to do, and his mind is along for the ride. Now contrast this with how Peter relates to alcohol. In the reference script we examined earlier about Rick Sanchez, Rick's drinking was analysed as self-medication. Rick drinks to numb his awareness of cosmic meaninglessness. Every sip is an attempt to make the knowledge of the void slightly less painful. Rick's relationship with alcohol is medicinal and desperate. Peter's relationship with alcohol is nothing like this. Peter drinks beer because he likes beer. Not because he is drowning sorrow, not because he is running from awareness, not because he needs to numb something. He likes the taste. He likes the social ritual of drinking with friends. He likes the warmth and relaxation that alcohol provides. His drinking is not philosophical. It is not symbolic. It is not a metaphor for anything deeper. It is a man who enjoys a physical sensation and pursues it regularly. This distinction matters because it reveals something important about the difference between Peter and characters like Rick Sanchez or Brian Griffin. Rick drinks because knowing too much is unbearable. Brian drinks because he cannot reconcile his intellectual pretensions with his actual failures. Peter drinks because beer is good, and drinking it with friends is good, and that is the entire story. Same substance, same behaviour, radically different philosophical foundations. The American tradition of anti-intellectualism is relevant here. Richard Hofstadter, in his 1963 book Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, documented a persistent strain in American culture that is suspicious of expertise, academic knowledge, and intellectual sophistication. Hofstadter traced this back to European colonialism and evangelical Protestantism, arguing that Americans have always been divided between respect for practical capability and suspicion of theoretical knowledge. Peter embodies this tradition, but not maliciously. He does not hate intellectuals. He does not campaign against expertise. He simply does not find intellectual activity interesting or useful. He prefers common sense to sophistication. action to analysis, the gut to the brain. And the show, while it clearly does not endorse Peter's anti-intellectualism as a political position, does something interesting with it narratively. It consistently shows Peter's instinctive, physical approach to problems, producing outcomes that are roughly equivalent to the outcomes produced by Brian's intellectual approach. Both of them fail, both of them succeed, both of them muddle through. The method does not seem to matter as much as either of them would like it to. Neil Postman argued in his 1985 book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, that television, as a medium, inherently favours entertainment over rational discourse. That the act of watching a screen is a passive physical experience that does not require or encourage the kind of focused intellectual engagement that reading a book demands. Peter is the ideal television viewer. He absorbs content without analysing it. He responds to stimuli without reflecting on them. He consumes entertainment the way his body consumes food, automatically, eagerly, and without any consideration of nutritional value. But the question Postman raised was whether this is bad for us, whether a culture organised around television and entertainment is a culture in decline. And Peter's existence complicates that question, because Peter, the ultimate television viewer, the man who watches without thinking, the body that consumes without reflecting, is not in decline. He is stable. He is consistent. He is, within the terms of his own existence, doing fine. He has been doing fine for over 25 years. Maybe the body knows something the mind does not. Maybe Nietzsche was right about the great reason. Maybe the body's preference for simple pleasures and physical experience and instinctive response is not a failure of intelligence, but an older, deeper form of wisdom that philosophy lost track of somewhere between Plato's cave and Descartes' sitting room. Or maybe Peter is just a cartoon character who likes beer. The answer probably depends on which kind of reason you trust. There is an episode that illustrates this tension between body and mind more clearly than almost any other in the series. In the season 1 episode, The Sun Also Draws, Chris gets kicked out of the Scouts. Peter insists on driving the family to the Scouts' New York headquarters to get Chris reinstated. The trip goes sideways almost immediately. Lois develops a gambling addiction at an Indian casino and loses the car. Peter, in order to get the car back, claims to be Indian and is sent on a vision quest. The vision quest is the closest Peter ever gets to a genuine spiritual experience. He and Chris go into the wilderness. They fast, they sit in silence. Peter hallucinates. He sees Fonzie. And in the middle of this absurd failed attempt at transcendence, something real happens. Peter and Chris bond. Peter accepts Chris's complaints about the Scouts. He listens to his son. He responds with something that resembles genuine parental understanding. Not because the vision quest worked, but because the physical conditions of the quest, the hunger, the isolation, the removal of distraction, stripped away Peter's defences and left him alone with his child in a way that normal life never allows. The body produced what the mind could not. The physical experience of sitting in the wilderness, without food or entertainment or distraction, created a space where connection was possible. Peter did not think his way to understanding his son. He was forced into it by physical circumstances. His body, starved and exhausted, stopped interfering with its usual demands, and something that looked like wisdom emerged in the silence. Nietzsche might have recognized this. The great reason of the body operating beneath the small reason of the mind, producing results that deliberate thought could not achieve. Peter did not intend to connect with Chris. He intended to get back into the Scouts. But the body had a different agenda, and the body's agenda was, in this instance, the wiser one. This is a pattern across the series. Peter's most genuine moments of connection with his family tend to happen not through conversation or deliberate effort, but through shared physical experience, through crises that force proximity, through situations that strip away the social performance and leave only the animal reality of people who share a home and a life. Peter cannot articulate love. but his body knows how to protect the people around him, how to be present in a room with them, how to occupy the same physical space with a consistency that his mouth and brain could never manage on their own. The implications of this go beyond Peter. They go to the core of how we think about intelligence and wisdom and what it means to know something. The Western tradition says that knowledge lives in the mind. That understanding is a cognitive process. That wisdom is the product of thinking. But Peter suggests, without knowing he is suggesting anything, that knowledge might also live in the body. That understanding might also be a physical process. That wisdom might be the product, not of thinking, but of being, of occupying space, of showing up, of the accumulated physical experience of a life lived in close proximity to other lives. There is a reason we say that someone knows something in their bones. There is a reason we talk about gut feelings and heart knowledge and the wisdom of the body. These are not just metaphors. They are descriptions of a way of knowing that philosophy has marginalized for centuries in favor of the mind. Peter knows things in his bones that Brian does not know in his brain. Peter's bones know that his family matters. Peter's bones know that his friends are worth keeping. Peter's bones know that the couch in the living room and the stool at the Drunken Clam are the two most important places in the world. His mind could not tell you why. His bones do not need to. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. There is a thought experiment in Nietzsche's work that might be the most demanding question any philosopher has ever asked. It appears in section 341 of The Gay Science, published in 1882, and it goes like this. What if a demon crept into your loneliest loneliness and said to you that you would have to live your life again? Every moment, every pain, every joy, every tedious afternoon, every devastating loss, everything exactly the same, in the same sequence for eternity. Would you be crushed by this news? Or would you call it the greatest thing you had ever heard? Nietzsche called this the eternal recurrence, and he meant it as a test, a way of measuring whether you have said yes to your life completely. If the thought of living your exact life again, infinitely, without change, fills you with horror, then something about how you are living needs to change. If it fills you with affirmation, then you have achieved what Nietzsche considered the highest possible relationship with existence. You have embraced life fully enough that you would choose to repeat it forever. Peter Griffin already lives in eternal recurrence, not as a thought experiment, as a format. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999. It was cancelled by Fox in 2002. The network had moved the show around the schedule so many times that building an audience was nearly impossible. It was placed against established competition. It was preempted. It was moved from Sunday nights to Tuesday nights to Thursday nights. Fox did everything it could to make the show fail, and then pointed to the low ratings as proof that it was failing. And then something happened that had never happened before in the history of television. Cartoon Network picked up the rerun rights for what was described as basically nothing. They started airing Family Guy on their late-night Adult Swim block on April 20th, 2003. The results were immediate. Family Guy became Adult Swim's #1 program overnight. Viewership for the block jumped dramatically. The show was averaging nearly 2 million viewers per episode in a late-night cable time slot. At the same time, Fox released the first and second seasons on DVD. The set sold 2.2 million copies, making Family Guy the best-selling television DVD of 2003. In 2004, Fox brought the show back. Family Guy became the first television series in history to be revived by the same network based on DVD sales. Think about what that means in the context of eternal recurrence. The show died, it was cancelled, it was over, and then it came back. It pushed the boulder to the top of the mountain, the boulder rolled back down, and instead of giving up, the show walked back down the mountain, picked up the boulder, and started pushing again. Fox said it was dead. The audience said it was alive. The show chose the audience. As of 2026, the show has aired over 450 episodes. Season 24 premiered on Fox on February 15th, 2026, with what Fox promoted as the show's 450th episode. The show has been running for over a quarter of a century, and it is still going. Peter Griffin is still sitting on his couch, still drinking his beer, still watching his television, still fighting the chicken. The boulder rolls, Peter pushes, the format continues. Nietzsche's eternal recurrence was meant to be terrifying. The thought of living the same life forever, making the same mistakes, experiencing the same losses, enduring the same tedium, was supposed to be the ultimate test of whether you truly love your life or merely tolerate it. But Peter does not find the recurrence terrifying because Peter does not perceive it. He does not know he is repeating. He does not experience the cycle as a cycle. Each episode is, for Peter, the first and only time. He does not carry the weight of previous iterations because his memory, whether by cognitive limitation or psychological necessity, does not retain them. And here is the thing that makes this genuinely, philosophically interesting. The recurrence is real. Peter's life genuinely repeats. The same problems, the same relationships, the same patterns, the same outcomes. It is eternal recurrence made structural, built into the architecture of the show itself. But because Peter does not perceive it, the terror is absent. The weight is absent. The existential burden that Nietzsche imagined, the crushing awareness of infinite repetition, does not exist for Peter because awareness does not exist for Peter. Not in this context, not about this. Nietzsche also wrote about the Übermensch, the overman, the being who creates their own values and affirms life with total commitment. Peter is not the Übermensch. He does not create values. He absorbs them passively from his environment, his television, his friends, whatever happens to be in front of him at any given moment. But Peter does something the Übermensch is supposed to do. He says yes to life. He says yes completely, unreservedly, without qualification or condition. He does not say yes because he has thought about it and concluded that yes is the correct answer. He says yes because he has never considered the possibility of saying anything else. His yes is automatic, instinctive, constitutional. Built into the way he exists is an unconscious yes, less meaningful than a conscious one. Nietzsche would probably say it is. The whole point of the eternal recurrence is the conscious choice to embrace repetition. Without consciousness, there is no choice, and without choice, there is no meaning to the embrace. But maybe meaning is not the point. Maybe the point is the embrace itself. Peter embraces his life the way his body embraces gravity, without thinking about it, without choosing it, without being able to not do it. And maybe that is not the highest form of affirmation, but it might be the most honest. The show has been saying yes for over 25 years. It died and came back. It was cancelled and returned. It pushed the boulder up the mountain, watched it roll back down, and started a new season on Sunday night. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. One does not need to imagine Peter happy. He is sitting right there, on his couch, in Quahog, in an episode that is exactly like the last one, and exactly like the next one, and he is fine. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. We have spent a long time with Peter Griffin tonight. We have looked at him through the lens of Plato and Mill and Epicurus and Camus and Nietzsche and Aristotle. We have examined his ignorance, his relationships, his pleasures, his body, his repetitive existence, and the possibility that everything we see on the show is a fantasy constructed by a grieving mind in a psychiatric facility. And now we need to step back and ask what all of this means. Not for Peter. Peter does not need us to interpret his life. He is doing fine without our analysis. The question is what Peter's life, examined from the outside by people who think more than he does, teaches us about our own. The first thing Peter teaches us is that being correct about the nature of reality does not make you happy. This is the lesson that runs underneath everything we have discussed. Brian Griffin is more correct than Peter about almost everything. Brian knows more, reads more, thinks more carefully, and engages with the world more honestly than Peter does. And Brian is an alcoholic who cannot finish a novel and whose romantic relationships consistently collapse. The reference script we examined about Rick Sanchez makes the same point at a cosmic scale. Rick is the smartest being in the universe. He understands reality with a clarity that no other character possesses. And Rick attempted suicide in his garage because the weight of that understanding became unbearable. Peter understands almost nothing about reality. He misreads social situations. He fails to grasp basic cause and effect. He lacks the cognitive architecture to process complex information or engage in abstract reasoning. And he goes home to his family every night. He drinks with his friends every week. He laughs at his television every evening. He sleeps in a bed next to his wife and wakes up in the morning and does it again. His ignorance is not admirable. It is not aspirational, but it is, within the terms of his existence, functional in a way that Brian's intelligence and Rick's genius are not. This does not mean ignorance is better than knowledge. It means that knowledge, by itself, is not enough. The Western philosophical tradition, from Socrates through the Enlightenment and into the present day, has operated on the assumption that more knowledge equals better living. That understanding the truth about yourself and the universe is the path to the good life, that the unexamined life is not worth living. Peter's life is almost entirely unexamined, and it is, by the crude but honest metric of day-to-day contentment, a life that works. It works badly in some ways. Peter causes harm. Peter is selfish. Peter is oblivious to the pain he inflicts on the people around him, particularly Meg. These are not minor flaws. They are serious moral failures that his ignorance does not excuse. But the life itself, the structure of it, the routine and the relationships, and the repetitive pleasures, that structure works. It keeps Peter moving forward. It keeps him functional. It keeps him, in his own limited and sometimes destructive way, happy. The second thing Peter teaches us is about the relationship between desire and happiness. Epicurus told us 23 centuries ago that the key to happiness is to keep your desires simple, to want what is easy to obtain, and to stop wanting what is difficult or impossible. The entire consumer economy of the modern world is built on the opposite principle. Want more, earn more, buy more, achieve more. The pursuit of happiness has become synonymous with the pursuit of more. And the result, as study after study has confirmed, is a population that has more material wealth than any civilization in human history, and that reports levels of anxiety, depression, and dissatisfaction that would have been unrecognizable to previous generations. Peter wants a beer and a television, and his friends and his family. That is the complete inventory of his desires. He does not want a promotion. He does not want recognition. He does not want a bigger house or a nicer car or a higher social status. When the show occasionally gives Peter these things, when he temporarily gains wealth or power or fame, the result is always negative. The higher desires destabilize him. They pull him away from the simple structure that keeps him grounded. And the episode always ends with Peter returning to his baseline. Beer, television, friends, family. The desires that Epicurus would have approved of. Epicurus said that, of all the means which wisdom acquires to ensure happiness throughout the whole of life, by far the most important is friendship. Peter's friendships are, by any sophisticated standard, crude. The conversations at the Drunken Clam are not philosophical. The activities the men share are not enriching in any traditional sense, but the friendships persist. They endure through betrayal and absence and moral failure and personal catastrophe. They survive because the men keep showing up. And that persistence, that habit of presence, is what Epicurus was actually talking about. Not the content of the friendship, but the commitment to it. Not what you say to each other, but the fact that you are there. The third thing Peter teaches us is about the relationship between consciousness and suffering. Camus argued that the absurdity of existence becomes tragic only at the rare moments when it becomes conscious. That the worker pushing his metaphorical boulder is fine until he pauses and realizes what he is doing. That awareness is the mechanism that converts mere difficulty into existential despair. Peter never pauses. Peter never becomes conscious of the pattern. The boulder rolls back down and Peter starts pushing again without a moment of reflection between rounds. His lack of awareness shields him from the suffering that awareness produces. This is not, by philosophical standards, an admirable state. Camus would say that Peter's happiness is not authentic because it has not been earned through confrontation with the absurd. Mill would say Peter's contentment is that of the pig, not of Socrates, and is therefore less valuable. Plato would say Peter is still in the cave and that his happiness is based on shadows, not reality. But here is the thing that none of them can deny. Peter's happiness is real. It is not hypothetical. It is not philosophical. It is not a conclusion reached through argument. It is experienced. It is felt. It is lived. And the philosophical tradition has never satisfactorily explained why a happiness that is experienced and felt and lived should be considered less valid than a happiness that is theorized about but rarely achieved. Socrates was executed by his own city. Camus died in a car accident at 46, having spent his life wrestling with the question of whether life was worth living. Nietzsche spent the last 11 years of his life in a state of mental incapacitation, unable to write or think or communicate meaningfully. Epicurus died of kidney stones at the age of 72, though he reportedly remained cheerful on his deathbed. The philosophers who dedicated their lives to understanding happiness had, at best, a complicated relationship with it. Peter Griffin, who has dedicated his life to watching television and drinking beer, experiences happiness more consistently and more reliably than any of them. This is not an argument against philosophy, it is an argument about the limits of philosophy. Philosophy can describe happiness, it can analyze happiness, it can define the conditions under which happiness is possible and identify the obstacles that prevent it. But philosophy cannot produce happiness. Thinking about happiness is not the same as experiencing it, and there is a persistent gap between knowing what makes a good life and actually living one that philosophy has never been able to close. Peter closes the gap by not knowing it exists. He does not know what eudaimonia means, but he experiences something functionally identical to it every time he sits down with a beer and watches the game. He does not know what ataraxia means, but he achieves something resembling it every time the episode resets and his anxieties dissolve with the closing credits. He does not know what the absurd is, but he has found a way to live inside it without suffering, which is exactly what Camus spent his career telling us we should try to do. The fourth thing Peter teaches us is that connection matters more than understanding. Peter does not understand Lois. He does not understand why she stays with him. He does not understand her needs or her frustrations or her inner life, but he is there. He is physically present in her life, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. He shows up, not because he has thought about the importance of presence in a relationship, because showing up is the thing he does. It is habit, it is routine, it is the body's great reason operating beneath the mind's awareness. And this applies to all of Peter's relationships. He does not understand his children. He cannot articulate what they mean to him. He lacks the vocabulary for emotional expression and the cognitive framework for emotional processing. But when his children are in danger, he acts. When his friends need him, he appears. When the family is threatened, Peter becomes ferocious in their defense, driven by a loyalty that operates at the level of instinct rather than thought. Aristotle would recognize this. Aristotle argued that virtue is a habit, not a decision. You do not become brave by thinking about bravery. You become brave by doing brave things repeatedly until bravery becomes your default response. Peter has become loyal not by thinking about loyalty, but by practicing it so consistently that it has become indistinguishable from who he is. His loyalty is not philosophical, it is constitutional, and it might, by Aristotle's own framework, qualify as a form of virtue, however unlikely that seems given everything else about Peter's character. The fifth and perhaps most important thing Peter teaches us is about the relationship between happiness and meaning. The philosophical tradition generally assumes that happiness requires meaning, that you cannot be truly happy without a sense of purpose, a connection to something larger than yourself, a reason for existing that gives your daily activities significance and direction. Peter has no sense of purpose. He has no connection to anything larger than his immediate experience. He has no philosophy of life, no system of values, no grand narrative that gives his existence significance. He gets up, he goes through his day, he goes to bed, he does it again. There is no arc, no trajectory, no progress toward a goal. There is just a repetition, day after day, episode after episode, season after season, and yet he is happy. Maybe happiness does not require meaning. Maybe happiness is what happens when you stop looking for meaning and just live. Maybe the relentless human drive to find purpose, to justify our existence, to connect our daily activities to some larger cosmic story, is not the path to happiness, but the obstacle to it. Maybe the examined life is not the only life worth living. Maybe it is just the only life that philosophers who have a professional interest in examination are willing to endorse. Peter would not articulate any of this. Peter would not articulate anything. If you asked him whether his life has meaning, he would probably say sure, and then ask if you wanted to watch something on TV. And that non-answer might be the most honest answer to the question that anyone has ever given. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. We have arrived at the end of a long journey tonight, and it is time to bring all of these threads together. We have spent hours with Peter Griffin, looking at him through philosophical lenses that he would not recognise and could not comprehend. And now we need to return to where we started and ask the question one final time. Is it better to be Socrates, dissatisfied, than a fool satisfied? John Stuart Mill posed that question in 1863, and the Western world has been answering yes for so long that we have forgotten it is a question and started treating it as a fact. Of course it is better to be aware than ignorant. Of course it is better to understand than to be confused. Of course it is better to examine your life than to drift through it unreflectively. Of course, the answer seems so obvious that questioning it feels perverse. But tonight we have watched Peter Griffin exist inside a life that challenges every one of those assumptions. And the challenge is not abstract, it is not theoretical, it is embodied. It lives in a house on Spooner Street in Quahog, Rhode Island, and it has been airing on Fox since January 31st, 1999, and it shows no signs of stopping. Let's go back through what we found. We started with Plato, the allegory of the cave, the prisoners chained to the wall, watching shadows, believing the shadows are real. The philosopher who escapes into the sunlight and sees truth. Peter is the prisoner who never leaves. He watches the shadows and calls them television. He sees flickering images on a screen and accepts them as the entirety of reality. And he is content. Not enlightened, not liberated, not living in the full brightness of philosophical truth, but content. Brian is the prisoner who left the cave. Brian has seen the sunlight. He has read the books and had the thoughts and engaged with the complexity of the real world. And Brian came back down into the cave and poured himself a martini and started complaining about how nobody in the cave appreciates literature. Brian's encounter with truth did not set him free. It made him pretentious. It gave him a vocabulary for his dissatisfaction without giving him a remedy for it. He knows more than Peter and is demonstrably worse off because of it. The show has been making this point for over 2 decades, not explicitly, not through dialogue or monologue or any kind of thesis statement, through structure, through the accumulated weight of hundreds of episodes in which Peter's ignorance produces roughly equivalent outcomes to Brian's knowledge, with the added benefit that Peter does not spend his evenings staring into a glass, wondering where his life went wrong. Then we looked at Epicurus, the ancient Greek who built a garden and invited his friends to eat bread and cheese and talk about what makes life good. Epicurus said that the greatest pleasures are the simplest ones. That friendship is the most important ingredient in happiness, that the absence of pain and anxiety matters more than the presence of luxury and achievement, that the smart move is to want less, not more. Peter wants less than almost anyone. His desires are the baseline human desires that Epicurus classified as natural and necessary: food, drink, companionship, shelter, rest. He does not want fame. He does not want legacy. He does not want to be remembered or admired or respected by people outside his immediate circle. He wants to sit with his friends at the Drunken Clam and drink a beer and talk about nothing in particular. And this desire, this stunningly simple desire, is satisfied every single week. Epicurus would point out that Peter lacks the philosophical wisdom that separates genuine Epicurean contentment from mere animal satisfaction. And Epicurus would be right. Peter has not reasoned his way to simplicity. He has not chosen simple pleasures after evaluating the alternatives. He is simple because simplicity is the only thing his mind can handle. His contentment is accidental, not philosophical, but the contentment is real. And the accident has produced results that 23 centuries of deliberate philosophical effort have struggled to replicate. Epicurus' students came to the garden seeking the good life. Peter found the good life without seeking it. He found it in a bar with a beer surrounded by friends who are deeply flawed and unreservedly loyal. If the destination is the same, does it matter that one person arrived by map and the other by stumbling in the dark? Then we looked at Camus, the boulder, the mountain, the eternal repetition of meaningless labour. Sisyphus pushing his rock forever, knowing it will roll back down, knowing nothing will change, knowing the punishment has no end and the work has no purpose. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, Camus wrote. It is the last line of his essay, the conclusion to his argument about why we should keep living even though life is absurd, even though nothing matters in any ultimate sense, even though the universe does not care whether we exist. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. Peter does not struggle toward the heights. Peter does not struggle toward anything. He lives laterally, moving through days without ascending or descending, without progress or decline, without the vertical drama that Camus imagined. His boulder rolls back down and he starts pushing again. But the metaphor barely fits because Peter does not experience the pushing as labour. He experiences it as Tuesday, and then Wednesday, and then the weekend. The repetition continues, but the suffering that Camus attached to it, the tragic consciousness that makes Sisyphus a hero, is entirely absent. We do not have to imagine Peter happy. We can observe it directly. He is happy in the way that sunlight is warm, without effort and without intention. His happiness is not heroic. It is not defiant. It is not the product of conscious revolt against the absurdity of existence. It is just there, a baseline condition that persists through disruption and catastrophe and resets with the reliability of a television schedule. Camus might say, this is not real happiness. That true happiness requires awareness, that you cannot authentically embrace life without first confronting its meaninglessness. That Peter's happiness is the happiness of the sleeper, not the happiness of the waking person. but we are all about to go to sleep. And maybe, as we drift off, there is something to be said for the happiness of the sleeper, for the contentment that does not require justification, for the rest that comes without examination, for the peace that arrives when you stop asking questions and simply close your eyes. Then we talked about moral responsibility, about whether Peter can be held accountable for the things he does, about Kant and Aristotle, and the philosophical frameworks that attempt to define when a person is culpable and when they're excused. Peter occupies a space that moral philosophy was not designed to handle. He is capable enough to exploit his diagnosis, but not capable enough to function without causing harm. He understands consequences in the moment, but does not retain them long enough to change his behaviour. He feels remorse occasionally, but cannot connect that remorse to a stable pattern of improvement. He is, in moral terms, a grey area that extends for 450 episodes with no sign of resolution. And the universe he inhabits makes the question moot. Consequences dissolve between episodes, injuries heal, deaths reverse. The moral calculus that every ethical system depends on, the idea that actions produce lasting results that can be evaluated, does not function in Peter's world. He is a moral agent in a universe that has been structurally designed to prevent moral accounting. You cannot hold Peter responsible because there is nothing left to hold him responsible for by the time the next episode begins. This is not a defense of Peter, it is an observation about the nature of the world he lives in, and it raises a question that is harder to answer than it seems. How much of our own moral seriousness depends on the permanence of consequences? If we lived in a world where injuries healed instantly, where death was reversible, where the damage we caused was erased every Sunday night, would we behave differently? Would we be more like Peter, not because we are stupid, but because the architecture of consequence that constrains our behaviour would no longer apply? Then we talked about God, about Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead and we killed him, about Peter's stepfather Francis, the devout Catholic who represented the old moral order and who died absurdly, crushed by a unicycle his own son was riding, about Peter creating the Church of the Holy Fonds, a religion based on a fictional television character, because the vacuum left by God's absence needed to be filled with something, and the Fonds was what Peter found. Nietzsche predicted that when God died, humans would create new idols, not because the new idols were worthy of worship, but because the human need for worship is structural and cannot be eliminated by removing its object. Peter's creation of Fonziism is this prediction made absurdly, almost mockingly literal. He worships a fictional character from a sitcom. His congregants follow him. The religion provides community and purpose and ritual, the same things every religion provides, organised around an object that is transparently, obviously, comically unworthy of worship. But the show treats Fonziism with the same level of seriousness and the same level of irreverence that it treats every other religion. Christianity is not spared. Judaism is not spared. Nothing is spared. The show's position, to the extent that it has one, is that all religious belief is equally constructed. That the distinction between worshipping God and worshipping the Fonds is a distinction of tradition and cultural weight, not of underlying truth. Peter does not fear God. He does not fear death. Epicurus said that these two fears, fear of the gods and fear of death, are the greatest obstacles to human happiness. Remove them and happiness becomes possible. Peter has removed them, not through philosophical reasoning, but through the same mechanism that characterizes everything else about his existence: oblivion. He does not fear God because he does not take God seriously enough to fear him. He does not fear death because death, in his universe, is a person you can talk to and negotiate with, and eventually get past. Then we talked about the fantasy theory, the reading of the show that places Peter in a psychiatric facility, building an entire animated universe to survive the loss of his wife and children. Under this theory, Peter's ignorance is not a product of low intelligence. It is a product of the most sophisticated defense mechanism the human mind is capable of producing. A mind that has experienced total loss and has chosen to construct a reality in which that loss never happened and can never happen. The cutaway gags become dissociative episodes. The status quo resets become the fantasy's structural refusal to permit permanent damage. Meg's ugliness and unpopularity become the subconscious distortion of a daughter too beautiful to recreate faithfully. Stewie's genius becomes the fantasy's gift to a child who never drew breath. And Peter's happiness, his relentless, stubborn, seemingly inexplicable happiness, becomes the reason the fantasy exists. The fantasy was built to be happy. It was designed from the ground up to be a world where happiness is possible, because the conditions that destroyed happiness in the real world have been reversed or removed or buried beneath layers of absurdity and denial. Whether you believe this theory or not, it changes the texture of everything else we have discussed. Under the fantasy theory, Peter is not a fool who stumbled into happiness. He is a devastated mind that built happiness from scratch, atom by atom, joke by joke, episode by episode, because the alternative was a darkness so complete that consciousness itself could not survive it. Then we talked about relationships, about Aristotle's 3 types of friendship, and how Peter's friendships at the Drunken Clam resist clean categorization, about Lois and the mystery of why she chose Peter and why she stays, about Meg and the role of the scapegoat in a family system, about Brian and the question of whether a dog who reads Proust is more of a person than a man who watches television. Peter's relationships are not sophisticated. They are not built on mutual understanding or emotional intelligence or shared intellectual interests. They are built on presence, on showing up, on the habit of being there, week after week, year after year, through everything. This is not nothing. In a world where relationships dissolve over text messages and friendships evaporate when people move to different neighbourhoods, the stubborn persistence of Peter's social world is remarkable. He has been drinking with the same 3 men at the same bar for over 25 years. He has been married to the same woman for the entire run of the show. His children, for all their dysfunction, continue to live in his house and eat at his table and navigate his chaos. Aristotle said that the highest form of friendship is the friendship of virtue, where people love each other for who they are rather than for what they provide. Peter's friendships are not friendships of virtue in any traditional sense, but there is a quality to their persistence that resembles something virtuous. The men at the Drunken Clam keep choosing each other, not because they are useful to each other, not because they share refined pleasures, but because they are who they are, and that is enough. The choosing itself, the repeated act of showing up, might be its own form of virtue, one that Aristotle did not describe but might have recognized. Then we talked about the body, about Nietzsche's claim that the body is the great reason and the mind is the small reason, about Peter living entirely through physical experience, through appetite and instinct and sensory engagement, while Brian lives through intellect and reflection and self-conscious analysis, about the chicken fights as pure physicality, the body asserting itself over narrative logic, about Peter's relationship with food and drink and physical pleasure being fundamentally different from Rick Sanchez's or Brian's, because Peter pursues pleasure for its own sake, not as medication for existential pain. Then we talked about eternal recurrence, about Nietzsche's demon who asks whether you would live your life again, exactly the same, forever. About the show's cancellation and revival, the first such revival in television history, driven by DVD sales and Adult Swim ratings. About the show's structure as a literal enactment of eternal recurrence, repeating the same patterns across hundreds of episodes without progress or resolution. About Peter's unconscious yes to life, his automatic embrace of existence that does not require the conscious choice Nietzsche imagined, but might be, in its own way, the most complete affirmation of life that any fictional character has ever demonstrated. And now we are here, at the end, with all of these threads laid out in front of us, overlapping and contradicting and reinforcing each other in ways that resist any single clean interpretation. Here is what I think we can say. Peter Griffin is not a philosopher. He is not a role model. He is not someone whose approach to life should be emulated in any direct or practical sense. He causes harm. He fails the people who depend on him. He does not grow. He does not learn. He does not improve. By almost every standard that philosophy uses to evaluate a human life, Peter falls short. But Peter is happy. And the philosophical tradition, for all its rigour and all its brilliance and all its centuries of accumulated wisdom, has never been able to guarantee that its practitioners would be happy. Socrates was put to death. Nietzsche went mad. Camus died in a car accident after spending his life arguing that life was worth living. Epicurus got closest, perhaps, with his garden and his bread and his friends, but even Epicurus recognised that his philosophy was a response to suffering, a way of managing the pain of existence, not a way of eliminating it. Peter does not manage the pain of existence. He does not encounter it. He moves through life the way water moves through a pipe, following the path of least resistance, accumulating nothing, resisting nothing, simply flowing. And the flow takes him where it takes him, and he arrives wherever he arrives, and he does not look back and does not look ahead and does not wonder whether there might be a better route. The philosophers would say, this is not living, that real living requires awareness, that you have to be conscious of your existence to be truly alive, that the unexamined life is not worth living, as Socrates declared in his defence before the Athenian jury that condemned him. But Socrates was on trial for his life when he said that. He was arguing that his habit of questioning people, of forcing them to examine their assumptions, was valuable enough to justify his existence. It was a defence, not a neutral philosophical claim. It was the statement of a man who had dedicated his life to examination and who needed that dedication to mean something. Of course, the examiner says that the examined life is the only one worth living. What else would he say? Peter would say that the unexamined life is the one he is living, and it seems fine to him. And the show, which has been running for over a quarter century, which has aired over 450 episodes, which was cancelled and revived and cancelled in all but name, and revived again, which has outlasted sitcoms and dramas and entire networks, which is still producing new episodes in 2026, the show seems to agree with Peter. The show keeps going. The show does not examine itself, at least not in any sustained or conclusive way. The show tells its jokes and airs its cutaways and resets its status quo and starts again the following week. The show is doing what Peter does, and the show, like Peter, is still here. Now I want to return to the fantasy theory one last time, because whether it is true or not, it offers something that the philosophical analysis alone cannot provide. It offers an emotional centre. If Peter is lying in a psychiatric facility, building this world inside his broken mind, then everything we have discussed tonight takes on a different weight. His happiness is not accidental. It is designed. It is the product of a mind that has experienced the absolute worst that human existence has to offer, and has responded by creating a universe where the absolute worst cannot happen, a universe where children cannot die permanently, where a wife who takes her own life is alive and healthy and standing in the kitchen, where a baby who was never born is the smartest person in the room. Under this theory, Peter's contentment is the most heroic thing in the show, not because it is philosophical, not because it is examined, not because it meets any standard that Mill or Plato or Camus would recognise, but because it was built from nothing, from the wreckage of a life that was destroyed completely. A mind that had every reason to surrender to darkness chose instead to build a world full of light. A stupid, vulgar, often cruel, sometimes beautiful world. A world with talking dogs and evil babies and chicken fights, and a fat man who laughs at things nobody else finds funny. A world that is, for all its flaws, a world where people come home at the end of the day, where the family is together, where the lights are on in the house on Spooner Street, and someone is watching television in the living room, and there is beer in the fridge, and the dog is asleep on the couch, and the baby is plotting something in his crib, and the children are alive. The children are alive. That is the thing that Peter's mind was trying to save. That is the thing the fantasy was built to protect. Not philosophical truth, not self-knowledge, not an examined life, a simple, stupid, animal certainty that the people you love are in the next room and that you'll see them in the morning. And maybe that is enough. Maybe that is the whole answer to every question philosophy has ever asked. Not what is the meaning of life, not what is the nature of truth, not how should we live, just the people you love in the next room, just the knowledge that they are there. Let's bring this home. We started tonight with John Stuart Mill, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied, and we have spent these hours watching a fool who is satisfied and wondering whether Mill was right. Here is where I land. Mill was not wrong, but he was not asking the right question. The right question is not whether it is better to be Socrates or the fool. The right question is whether the distinction matters to the fool, and the answer is that it does not. The fool does not know he is a fool. The fool does not know that a philosopher is looking down on him from a height of intellectual superiority and declaring his happiness insufficient. The fool is watching television and drinking a beer, and his wife is in the kitchen, and his children are upstairs, and his friends are at the bar, and the show will be on again next Sunday. Plato said the unexamined life is not worth living. Peter's life is unexamined. Epicurus said happiness comes from simple pleasures. Peter's pleasures are simple. Camus said one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Peter is happy without the imagining. Nietzsche said to affirm life completely. Peter affirms life the way he does everything else, without thinking about it. Aristotle said virtue is a habit. Peter's habits are not virtuous, but his loyalty is, and his presence is, and his stubborn refusal to stop showing up for the people he loves, in his broken and inadequate way, is something that looks like virtue if you squint. None of these frameworks fully captures Peter. He slips through every philosophical net. He is too stupid for existentialism, and too happy for nihilism, and too destructive for Epicureanism, and too oblivious for absurdism. He does not fit, and his refusal to fit might be the most honest thing about him. Peter Griffin, a fat man in a white shirt with an IQ of about 70, and a laugh that sounds like someone choking on their own good time. He never read Epicurus. He never heard of Camus. He does not know what the word eudaimonia means, and he would not care if you explained it to him. He cannot spell Nietzsche, and he would not try, but he goes to the bar with his friends on Friday nights. He comes home to a wife who, for reasons philosophy cannot explain, loves him. He sits on his couch. He opens a beer. He turns on the television. The show starts. The boulder is at the bottom of the mountain. And Peter, without knowing what he is doing, or why he is doing it, or that anyone is watching, starts pushing. And one must imagine Peter happy. But we do not have to imagine. He is right there, on a couch, in a house, on a street called Spooner, in a town called Quahog, in a state called Rhode Island, with a beer in one hand and a remote in the other. His wife is in the kitchen, his dog is on the floor, his baby is building something in his room that could either destroy the world or save it. His daughter is in her room, holding the weight of a family that does not know she is holding it. His son is watching television somewhere, the apple that did not fall far from the tree. The show will air again next Sunday. The boulder will be at the bottom of the mountain. Peter will not know it is a boulder, and he will not know it is a mountain. He will just start pushing, because that is what he does, and that is who he is, and that is the only answer he has ever needed. Somewhere, in a university lecture hall, a philosophy professor is explaining to a room full of students why the examined life is is the only one worth living. Somewhere, in a bar, not unlike the Drunken Clam, 4 friends are sitting together, and none of them are examining anything except the bottom of their glasses. Somewhere, in a garden outside Athens, 23 centuries ago, Epicurus is breaking bread with his friends and telling them that this, right here, this simple meal with the people you love, is the whole point. Peter would not understand the professor. Peter would recognize the bar. And Peter, in his own accidental, inarticulate, utterly unphilosophical way, would recognize the garden. He would sit down, he would eat the bread, he would not ask why, and he would be fine. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.